I grew up in a family of hunters. My dad took me on my first trip when I was 10, teaching me everything from how to handle a rifle to the importance of respecting the forest and its creatures. Every year, as soon as the leaves turned red and gold, he and I would drive up to the same thick woods in northern Maine, camp out, and hunt by day. But this year was different. Dad had passed away last winter, and for the first time, I was going up there alone. I wanted to honor his memory. He always told me that a hunter should never fear the wilderness, but respect it. As I parked the truck, looking at the dense, shadowed woods ahead, I felt his absence more than ever. I took a breath, strapped on my rifle, and ventured out, hoping the solitude might give me a sense of peace. By the time dusk settled, I was miles deep into the woods, near a ridge my dad had talked about for years. He swore that's where the biggest bucks roamed, but for all his stories, we'd never managed to get that far out. I set up a small camp by the ridge and crawled into my tent, hoping to get some sleep before sunrise. Then I heard a single sharp snap, like someone stepping on a dry branch outside my tent. I lay still, holding my breath, ears straining. The hair on my arms prickled. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peered out, gripping my flashlight. The beam barely cut through the trees, but then, just beyond the tree line, I saw a dark figure, standing still, maybe 30 feet away. It was tall and thin, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out its face, but it felt wrong, unnatural. I shone my flashlight on it, my heart racing, but the light didn't seem to reach it. I blinked, and it was gone, melting back into the night. I tried to shake it off. "Just your nerves, Tom," I muttered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next day, as I trekked further into the woods, I kept catching glimpses of it in the corner of my eye, always far enough to be barely seen, but close enough that I couldn't ignore it. Each night, as I sat by my fire, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I'd hear rustling, branches snapping, but no animals made themselves known. The silence was oppressive, and it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. I didn't sleep much, but leaving felt wrong, like I was letting fear get the best of me. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my rifle, I plunged into the woods, determined to confront whatever was stalking me. I didn't make it far before my flashlight flickered, then died completely. I froze, listening to the quiet, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, it stepped out of the shadows. Only 10 feet away, it stared at me with cold, glittering eyes, unlike any animal I'd seen. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My instincts screamed to run, but I felt rooted to the ground, as though I was being hunted. Finally, I forced myself to turn and sprinted blindly through the woods, hearing it crashing through the brush behind me. I barely made it back to camp, where I found my tent slashed open, my gear scattered. I couldn't explain it, nothing made sense anymore. I grabbed my things and left before sunrise, not daring to look back. Some locals later told me about legends of a creature called the Shadow of the Ridge, a spirit that guarded the land against intruders. I laughed it off at first, chalking it up to superstition, but I knew better. To this day, I haven't gone back to those woods. Whatever's out there, some things are best left undisturbed. It was supposed to be a routine trip. Just me and my buddy Ethan, heading out for a weekend of hunting in the Alaskan backcountry. We'd been planning this for months, eager to leave behind our desks and screens for a few days to live off the land and maybe come back with a good buck or two. We were about a day's hike from the nearest road, surrounded by thick forest and nothing but the sounds of nature. It was perfect. Or, at least, it started that way. Our first night out, around midnight, I was woken up by the sound of footsteps near our tent. I figured it was just a curious deer or maybe a bear sniffing around. I nudged Ethan awake, and we grabbed our flashlights and knives, ready to scare off whatever was lurking outside. But when I unzipped the tent and shined my light, there was nothing there, not even a sign of movement. We shrugged it off, figuring it might have been our imaginations, or maybe just the wind rustling the bushes. The next day, we trekked deeper into the woods, setting up camp by a small stream. We spent the whole day hunting, barely managing to catch sight of anything. The animals seemed scarce, but we didn't think much of it. When dusk fell, we returned to camp, exhausted and ready to turn in. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up again to footsteps. This time, they were closer, moving slowly around the tent in a circle. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, like someone was pacing just outside. Ethan was awake too, his eyes wide in the dim light of the tent. We whispered to each other, debating whether to call out, when suddenly we heard the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. My heart stopped. There was no way it was an animal. My mind raced. Who would be out here, this far from civilization, armed and lurking around our camp in the middle of the night? We stayed silent, hoping whoever it was would leave, but the pacing continued. And then we heard a low cough, chillingly close. My grip tightened on my knife. Ethan mouthed to me, "Stay quiet." We both knew our hunting rifles were outside the tent, useless now. The footsteps eventually faded, retreating into the darkness. We lay there, wide awake, listening for hours, but the forest had gone silent again. At dawn, we cautiously emerged, scanning the area. There were boot prints around our tent, large, deep impressions in the dirt. Someone had been watching us. Neither of us said anything, but the unspoken decision was clear. It was time to leave. As we packed up, we kept our rifles close, senses on high alert. But the forest seemed to close in tighter as we made our way back. A few miles down the trail, we found something else that sent a chill down my spine. A small makeshift trap, hidden under leaves, a tangle of wire strong enough to trip someone and cause serious harm. Ethan pointed out several more as we continued, each set up deliberately, as if someone was trying to catch or injure us. The last leg of the hike felt endless. We were sure we were being followed, the occasional crack of a branch or snap of a twig keeping us on edge. The worst part was that we never actually saw anyone. No shadowy figure, no sign of our stalker, just an unsettling sense that eyes were always on us. By the time we reached the road, both of us were exhausted, drained from fear more than physical effort. We piled into Ethan's truck and drove away in silence, glancing back at the trailhead one last time, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching us leave. To this day, we don't know who or what was out there with us, but we haven't been back. What I do know is this: sometimes the scariest things in the wilderness aren't the animals or the elements. Sometimes it's the people you don't see, the ones who linger just out of sight and make sure you know you're not welcome. I've always loved hunting alone, just me and the wilderness. There's something freeing about being so far from civilization, with only your instincts to rely on. But after what happened last fall, I'm not sure I'll ever go out alone again. It was late October, and I'd hiked deep into the Montana wilderness, hoping to find a good spot for elk. The day was clear, but it was cold, and I knew the weather could change quickly up in these mountains. I set up camp near a stream, feeling lucky I hadn't crossed paths with anyone else. It was exactly what I wanted: isolation, quiet, and nothing but the sounds of nature. On the second day, I noticed something odd. I was following some tracks, which I hoped belonged to a decent-sized buck, when I stumbled upon a small, weathered cabin in a clearing. It looked abandoned, its wood faded and roof sagging. I'd hunted these woods for years and had never come across this place. Curious, I walked up to it, rifle in hand, and peered through a broken window. Inside was a mess of rotting furniture, old papers scattered across the floor, and what looked like a trapper's tools rusted beyond use. But what struck me was a row of photographs tacked along one wall. They were mostly faded, some torn, but I could make out details' faces, some laughing, some in groups, most looking straight at the camera. I recognized the look in their eyes. People who were out here for the same reason I was, to get away. But that wasn't the strange part. As I looked closer, I noticed a photo pinned at the end of the row, slightly different from the others. It was a Polaroid, and it looked newer, less yellowed by time. And there, in the center of the shot, was me, standing by my truck at the trailhead just 2 days ago, looking down at my map. My blood ran cold. How could this be possible? I'd been alone since I arrived. I backed away, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, rifle raised, but there was no one there. Only the dense trees, silent and still. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but every instinct in me screamed that I was being watched. The thought hit me like a punch. Whoever took that photo could still be here. I walked quickly back to camp, resisting the urge to break into a run. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, but all I saw were shadows. Back at my camp, I started packing up in a hurry. Just as I was about to throw my pack on, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another Polaroid, pinned to the tree just outside my tent. This one showed me crouching over my gear that morning, unaware. I yanked it off the tree, my eyes darting around the campsite. I felt exposed, vulnerable. With everything packed, I started the hike back to my truck, glancing over my shoulder the entire time. Every small noise, the crackle of leaves, the snap of a branch made my pulse race. The trees pressed in, feeling closer than they had on the way out. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was greeted by another Polaroid, taped to my truck's side mirror. It showed me in the distance, hiking through the trees, rifle slung over my shoulder. I ripped it down, threw my gear in the truck, and got out of there as fast as I could. I don't know who took those photos or why they followed me. Maybe it was some twisted game, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I wasn't alone out there, and someone was watching me from the moment I arrived. Since then, I've stuck to hunting with friends. And whenever I pass by that old trailhead, I swear I feel a pair of eyes on me, watching, waiting for me to come back alone.